Dear colleagues, first of all, I greet and thank the organizer of the conference and wish all the participants good work. It is a pleasure for me to take part in the conference, even if only by video. Unfortunately, family problems prevent me from being in Canada. I also apologize for my English, but it is not very fluent. I am going to share my video with you and start with my presentation. The title of the presentation is Sociology of Crisis through Pitirim Sorokin's Scholarly Legacy, Current Problems, Resilience and Community. Which starting from the updating of Sorokin's theory on the crisis, want to reflect on some issues that today are essential for the study of crisis in the 21st century, and will do so in these 4 points. Let's start with the first points. If we want to broadly define the concept of crisis, we could say that crisis can be defined as sudden and destabilizing events or situations that threaten the balance, security, and or daily life of an individual, a community, an organization, or a society as a whole and are differentiated by their nature. But already in 1941, in his book, The Crisis of Our Age, Sorokin had been much more explicit in saying that the crisis we were experiencing in those years had nothing ordinary about it. And in fact, he states what you can read below. In this same book, Sorokin analyzes the crisis in the Western world in depth and makes a diagnosis outlining the study perspectives, one optimistic and the other pessimistic. The pessimistic one considers the crisis as an ordinary economic crisis and therefore surmountable with some interventions. To resolve this crisis, he proposed the adaptation of the different conditions, economic and political, or the elimination of the wicked mean. In those times, the reference was to Hitler and Mussolini. Today, there will be no shortage of names to mention. In the case of the pessimistic vision, the crisis is seen as the agony that precedes the future death of Western society and culture. Both consider failures. For Sorokin, in fact, the crisis is reduced neither to political and economic contrast, nor to destruction of culture and society. It can be traced back to the fact that all the social phenomena of Western society and culture have never been integrated into a single system and the solution to this. The crisis could only happen through 5 fundamental steps for Sorokin. 1, a rapid recognition of the crisis, the recognition that the sensate system is not the only possible form of society, the movements from one system to another, for a profound re-examination of value, and finally, a transformation of the forms of social relationships and forms of social organization, hand in hand with the change in cultural mentality. The change had to take place for Sorokin with the change in the forms of relationships, moving from antagonist behavior and contractual to purer relationships in order to transform the system of value and the conduct of individuals towards others, cultural values, and of the world in general. In this way, Sorokin can be considered a promoter of overcoming modern sensate culture in the direction of a transformation of relationship between individuals and between them and institutions through the rediscovery of the positive value of man, solidarity, love relationships, altruistic creative love. It is no coincidence that the terms used by Sorokin are solidaristic and antagonistic behavior since his doctoral thesis in the 1920s. Let us remember that Sorokin created the Harvard Research Center in Creative Altruism, which researched for 10 years on these very topics. In the 1951 book, SOS, The Meaning of Our Crisis, Sorokin continues his analysis of the crisis and addresses three aspects of the crisis of the previous decade: the Great Destroyer, polarization, and totalitarianism, which together create the murderous trend. For Sorokin, the Great Destroyer is embodied in the ruling groups and their staff members. For polarization is a transposition of the law identified in the book Man and Society in Calamity. In its generalized form, it indicates that crisis or similar situation highlight all the contrasts that are latent both in the mind of the single individual and in groups. The last of the three aspects concern totalitarianism, worsens in phases of crisis or calamity as governments centralize their powers. This leads Sorokin to say that the medicine against totalitarianism is not war, but peace and lack of emergency. The diagnostic activity of Sorokin continues even after the 1950s years, and in the collection, The Basic Trends of Our Time, he identified three trends that he considers fundamental for the modern times we were experiencing and which you see reported here in the list. But now there is a question, but how do we get out the crisis? Sorokin answers this question in a very simple way. He argued that there is only one way to take the path out of the crisis, regardless of its nature: strengthening relationships and interaction that produce positive effects for all members of society. In summarizing the remedies for resolving the crisis in sensitive society, the main reason for man's impotence is being creatively altruistic, is the neglected of these phenomena by science during the last first century. According to Sorokin, it is a priority for the science to correct the incorrect conception of man and the social cultural universe. And for this reason, research plans that study human energy, truth, beauty, and goodness. Sorokin claims that the antidote to save lies in the affirmation of universal altruism. Let's now look at the second point of my presentation. Sorokin diagnoses date back over half a century. The crises not only continue to repeat themselves, certainly with different forms, but more often than not they produce the same devastating effects and require the exact same remedies that Sorokin had identified. Today, in contemporary society, we can think by analogy of the crisis described by Sorokin, starting from the financial crisis of 2008, which worsened with the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which produce harmful effects that are still not definitively quantifiable today on a material, social, and psychological level. This leads us to say that in order to study crisis, there is a need for an integrated knowledge system, the three forms of knowledge: empirical, sensory, reason, and intuition, capable of making available as many elements as possible for understanding of superorganic sociocultural phenomena, and therefore, where possible, also predict their transformations. All this pushes us to argue that we need to return to the idea of putting man at the center by starting a new discussion on the importance of the social, human, and environmental dimension, both at the national and supranational level, which aims at well-being collective and therefore towards another world possible. Crises, therefore, are perceived as an increase in disorder within an individual and collective system, which in fact constitutes the social space and which causes a blockage of the organizational devices, determining rigidities and the dissolution of conditions hitherto suppressed. Social space, therefore, takes on a fundamental importance since, as Sorokin himself had defined it in a certain way, it is not a container within which individuals move and or simple experience, but it is the brick agora within which the daily religious, civil, and political life of the inhabitants of the polis took place, construction of social reality. Even though we are faced with a single structure, there are different dimensions: economic, political, and socio-cultural. As Habermas stated, which push toward the crisis, but at the same time, these constitute the same dimensions that can provide the solution to the crisis, regardless of its nature. As far as I am concerned, the dimensions are specifically in the table you can see. This summary is obviously not exhaustive, but only illustrative to move the reflections towards the analysis and understanding of the manifestations, actions, through which the members of the community within the different social spaces considered the different sphere of contemporary society responding under crisis condition. And so we arrive at the third point of my presentation. A world free from crisis condition, social, economic, and political, and others, is not conceivable. One can imagine, however, a world in which the negative consequences of this condition are reduced or even avoided. The chain of crises of the last decades has shown that vulnerability is increasing, and this not only for the sections of the population that have always been recognized as vulnerable, and this makes us ask a question. But what happens in a crisis and or emergency situation? What change occur or must be promoted so that individual and collective dynamics move towards resilience and therefore towards the construction and strengthening of bonds and social capital? We try to answer that question. Crisis and disaster are not to be considered as sui generis, but represent a normal moment in the flow of life, which also allows the recognition of characteristics of social systems that may not otherwise be recognized as the related events cause consequence on the vital level and on the mechanism of social psychological regulation, as well as social change. In light of this, it can be deduced that thinking about the future during or after an emergency cannot ignore the existence of a community, which is one of the many declinations of social space and therefore an expression and resource of a territory, as described in the two boxes that you can observe. The key concept is that resilience, which is generally defined as the ability of an individual or a group to return to normality after events that have produced negative effects through two components. One of a personal nature, how the person is and how he responds to events, the other of a situational nature. Resilience, according to Norris and their collaborators, arises from resources present in the community, economic development, the social capital, information and communication, the competence of the community. This brings the reflection back to what Sorokin argued regarding the future of humanity and its development. It is not law, nor education, much less religion or economic or science that is sufficient for this text, that is assigned to humanity itself. What is it, however, that allows the construction of a resilient community? The answer is simple yet banal. It is social capital which, due to its interconnections with many other elements of society, contributes significantly to building community resilience. This concept has inherent in itself a conception of development of a holistic nature, as it does not stop at the economic aspects, but is connected to the degree of civicness and freedom of the community, and above all to the adaptation of correct behaviors that are based on trust. It presents itself as the multiplier of the possible. It only makes sense if it is aimed at multiplying its potential, that is, producing and reproducing. It must be considered a public good that must be protected for collective well-being. This conception brings us to the last point and therefore to the conclusion. It is clear that thinking about the future during or after a crisis cannot ignore the existence of a community or group of individuals that takes the form of such, since it is from the significant interaction that are established in them and which in themselves can be considered positive, that planning and reconstruction of identity and value sets must arise as supported by Sorokin. To conclude, along this logic, we could hope for the construction of a model of best practice deriving from these forms of positive experiences to be replicated in different territories and for different population targets in condition of fragility, which can, in crisis or non-crisis situation, being able to support the intervention of the institution from below by putting into practice what Sorokin strongly supported, according to which the salvation of humanity is only in the hands of the humanity. Thank you for your attention, and I say you good work for the during of the conference.